So hi there, my name's Chris Mitchell. I work at King County Behavioral Health and Recovery Division here in King County, Washington. And I'll be talking about kind of how to promote person-centered recovery through kind of behavioral health and criminal legal system coordination. So my presentation will outline kind of some of these efforts that my government, my Community and Human Services Department here in King County, what we've done to try to help people access person-centered behavioral health care for folks connected to the criminal legal system. Right, so the work of my team is really at that intersection of behavioral health and the criminal legal system. So that's where I'm coming from and the focus that I'll give. And I'll provide recommendations for some of the direct service providers out there who are doing kind of some of this face-to-face work, as well as some kind of policymakers and funders and mental health agencies who are kind of at the core of this as well. So a little bit about me. My name is Chris Mitchell. I am trained as a social worker, and I've been working in Seattle in primarily community mental health. I got my start providing kind of bilingual Spanish and English therapy to children, youth, and families, as well as adults. And then in 2017, I began a role as a team lead for an Assertive Community Treatment team that was just formed here in Seattle. And I was there for about 2 years before I came to King County government and the Behavioral Health and Recovery Division, where I now provide administrative oversight of those 4 regional ACT teams that we have here. And at King County, I'm part of the Diversion and Reentry Services team, where my team works to connect individuals in the criminal legal system to behavioral health services. I will also just mention a quick note about King County for those of you who may not be familiar with kind of our area or our region. So it's the home to Seattle, Washington. I'm in Seattle right now. And we've got over 2.2 million people living here, which is more than the population of New Mexico. And geographically, it's a large county as well, right? We are largest in the state of Delaware, right? Somewhere between sort of Delaware and Connecticut in size. So this is a really diverse population, right, with diverse needs. Compared to the national average, we have more people of color, we have more people who are foreign born, more people speaking a language other than English at home, right? And over the last 20 years, since 1990, the kind of increase in population that we've seen is largely from communities of color. So it's a big area, it's a big population, and we've got a lot of diversity here. Lastly, just to kind of clarify some things, my accent. So I was born in England, grew up and went to high school in New Jersey, lived in Boston for 5 years and have been in Seattle for 6. So if anybody had like indiscernible or confusing or strange accent on their conference bingo card, you can check that off. But note that we don't accept New Zealand or South Africa as the correct response. So what are we going to talk about today? As I mentioned about myself, my experience comes from the Assertive Community Treatment Model. So we'll start by learning about this model and why it's effective. Then I'll provide a little bit more information about my team and kind of the work that we do here at King County, and place these on what's called an intercept model that shows how people kind of move through and come into contact with the criminal legal system. And then I'll outline a couple of different ways that we can apply these kind of ideas and concepts to programs or services that you might be connected to, right? So I hope to provide information and suggestions that are both relevant to direct service providers, as well as the folks like me who might be administering some of these programs. So I will just make a couple quick notes here on some language. I don't like using acronyms, so I've tried to use very few. But I will just point out a couple that I'll use. So I've already mentioned ACT, or Assertive Community Treatment. That's when you see ACT on the PowerPoint presentation, or ACT as I say it, that's what I'm referring to. Here in Washington, we call it PACT, the Program of or Program for Assertive Community Treatment. They're essentially the same thing. It's just slightly different names. Also, I'm going to be using the word criminal legal system, or the phrase criminal legal system, and not the criminal justice system. And that's intentional because the criminal justice system does not always enact justice. right? And it's a criminal legal system, but it doesn't always do justice to the folks who are served there. And so our job is to try to divert people away from that system. And I also want to distinguish that from the civil legal system, which is a little bit different as well. I might refer to DRS, or Diversion and Reentry Services, right? That's my team at the county who does this kind of work. So you'll see that throughout the presentation a little bit. And just for good measure, you might see some tomatoes or tomatoes, but they're the same thing as well. So what do we do here at King County? This is just a little bit of a background, and I'll start with that graphic, right? So, we focus on helping people through and helping people avoid criminal legal involvement. So we focus on serving the most vulnerable individuals, right? That's folks with a lot of jail bookings, that's folks who are experiencing homelessness, and those with behavioral health conditions. And so the goal is to kind of divert them to a more kind of coordinated and therapeutic health and human services response, and helping them stay out of the criminal legal system, right? So we develop and administer these programs. One of the things we also do is center people with lived experience in what we do and have them inform program design. And we try to support the whole person, right, with the ultimate goal of kind of reducing the time that people spend in incarceration or in jail and in hospitals, and helping those people live more independently in the community, right? So getting them out of the jails and prisons, emergency rooms, hospitals, into less restrictive settings. So let's focus on that first learning objective here, right? So what is ACT? What's assertive community treatment, and why is it effective? How can it be person-centered? So assertive community treatment is one of the most successful treatment models for individuals with severe mental health conditions. And I do just want to say that here in King County and here in Washington, we have incorporated the recovery model into ACT. So what I'm describing is person-centered, and the recovery model kind of as it's applied to ACT. I want to recognize that there may be folks attending this conference, and certainly folks across the country who may not have experienced ACT services in the same way. Right. So when I speak about this, it's kind of the ideal model, what we strive for, with recovery principles kind of woven throughout. And I just want to say that might not be how everybody has experienced ACT, but this is sort of how we understand it. So ACT was developed in Wisconsin in the 70s as part of the deinstitutionalization movement, originally conceptualized as like a hospital without walls, right? The sort of intensive supports like are provided in a hospital, but in the community, right? And so the goal, the mission is to help people become more independent and integrate into the community with their recovery. And ACT has been shown to be effective, right? It's been well researched, and it's been shown to kind of reduce hospitalization, to help people retain housing, to engage some folks who have a hard time getting what they need out of the behavioral health system, and ultimately increasing quality of life, right? And that's one of the pieces that's most important to us, is that there's greater consumer satisfaction. So like I mentioned, the recovery model is central to services that ACT teams deliver, at least here in King County. The recovery model talks about kind of promoting wellness and independence, right? There's more focus on hope, independence, self-empowerment, personal development, right? And really focused on making sure that the person who's receiving these services feels like they're in recovery, right? Feels like they are doing better. And there's less focus on being symptom-free, right? It's not, the medical model talks about like a return to pre-symptom state, right? Or a symptom-free state when everything was like it was before. And that's not really what we strive for in the recovery model and in the ACT services that we deliver here locally. It's more on that, again, kind of hope, independence, and kind of personal feelings of satisfaction and recovery. And part of what's central to that is social connections, right? So ACT is relationship-based. The first several months of services are focused on kind of building relationships and trust, getting to know each other, engaging people in different settings. And so that those kind of caring and trusting and respectful relationships are really key. Similarly, ACT teams work with families and other supportive providers to kind of facilitate that integration of participants into their community. because we know that no person is an island. And so the more that we can kind of bring these families, friends, other neighbors, pastors into services and into the person's recovery, the better off we are. There are a lot of different person-centered elements at the heart of the ACT model that promote self-determination and promote this idea of hope and recovery. Right, I've already talked about how it's relationship-based. Sometimes that can take months or a year, right? And that's okay because those relationships are central. ACT also uses a strength-based approach, right? It's not a one-size-fits-all model, but relies on the interest, strengths, and assets of participants to shape what kind of services they're going to receive, right? So if, for example, somebody's relaxation strategy is to play guitar because they just can't sit still, I'm not going to teach them mindfulness meditation, which might be all about sitting still, because that's not going to work for them, right? So it's collaborative, right? There's the person, the participant, the consumer has a central role in saying what they want out of services. And ultimately the goal is graduation, greater independence, right? More freedom. The goal is to transition people to less intensive services. So this is just kind of an image. I went through some of the recent referrals that we've had to ACT services here in the county and just kind of picked out some of the core themes of what people are looking for. And so this is when sort of asked about what are your goals or what are your strengths or who are your natural supports, this is kind of what people had to say, right? I want to get a job. I want to go to college. I need housing. I want to work, right? It's important to me to be creative. I'm likable. I'm friendly, right? And so these are all kind of, I think this is a really good image of kind of what ACT recovery might look like for some people. And there are also kind of structural elements to ACT that make it more accessible, comprehensive, and person-centered, right? So ACT services are delivered in the community, right? The services are community-based. So we go to people's homes to meet them in coffee shops, and that outreach includes to jails and hospitals. Right, we have a multidisciplinary team to provide diverse services, right? We have peer specialists, we have mental health therapists, we have a psychiatric prescriber who prescribes medications. We've got substance use specialists who can help people change the amount of drugs or alcohol that they're consuming if they want to. There's a vocational specialist and a nurse, right? There's so much support on the teams to really kind of help them wrap around an individual's needs. There's also a low census, right? So there's about one staff member for every 10 participants. When I was an outpatient therapist, I was serving 50 people at a time, right? And so the idea that it's only a 1 to 10 ratio means that those folks have a lot more time and attention. And lastly, peer specialists have a really integral role on the team. They support participants' recovery. They're the voice for lived experience in the room, and they relate to participants on a more personal level by maybe sharing their own recovery story and kind of being more of a peer in that way. And so, like I said, these services kind of wrap around program participants, right? So the goal is kind of to meet all of the needs of the people that we're serving with all of these different kind of specialists on the team. But at the heart of it is the ACT participant, right? And so the care team kind of supports the participants in navigating through these different systems, right? The housing system, medical care, accessing benefits, navigating through legal systems, right? The team is there to kind of help this navigation throughout these systems. So we got through part number one, and hopefully I've been able to kind of illustrate like these different person-centered elements that promote recovery, right? The relationship-based, the focus on wellness and independence, the focus on hope, right? The fact that it's strengths-based, that it's not office-based, right? Because even sometimes just getting into an office can be such a barrier for people to get the right kind of care that they need. And lastly, really centering peer specialists on the team kind of helps to focus on the whole person and all of their needs. So moving on to the second learning objective, what we're looking to do now is identify some of those touch points in the legal system where we can connect individuals to different kind of on-demand behavioral health services. I'll come back to this slide again, just to kind of remind you about like what we're trying to do here, right? We're trying to get people away from that criminal legal response and into more kind of supportive health and human services. There's, oops, sorry, I went the wrong way. But there's a central challenge there, right? That there are several groups and populations who are overrepresented in the criminal legal system, right? That includes individuals with mental health conditions, individuals using substances, drugs or alcohol, right? And especially people of color and other marginalized groups, right? We know the disparate impacts of incarceration, of police brutality on communities of color. And that hasn't happened in a vacuum, right? Policy changes have resulted in higher rates of incarceration over the year. We've seen arrests for misdemeanors be on the rise, right? For disorderly conduct, for trespassing, for public intoxication, right? Mandatory minimums for substance use or drug possession. And with a lot of these, like individuals who are experiencing homelessness are more vulnerable to arrests. You know, when people don't have a place to sleep, if they're in a park, they might be trespassing, right? If they're in just looking to survive and get by, that might be seen as criminal behavior, right? And also like the increase in legal costs, right? All of the fines and fees and the cost of bail, all of that makes it harder for people to exit the legal system after they've been arrested, right? So even if you're already in the system, it's harder to get out, right? And this graph here sort of shows the rates of institutionalization and shows the kind of rates of folks in mental health hospitals going down pretty significantly in the sort of 60s and 70s, but in the 80s, kind of studying the trend that more and more people spending time in prisons and jails, right? So, I mean, what the result is that, you know, these institutions that we rely on have made it harder for individuals with mental health conditions to live successful and independent lives in the community, right? They do not have the resources they need, and it is harder to get by. It's harder to be successful and satisfied, living, working, relating to other people. And people often get trapped in the legal system without a way out, right? And so for folks who have different needs, like connecting them to the right services is the social justice work that we are committed to here at King County and on my team, right? The criminal legal system does not administer justice to everybody. And in a lot of cases, it's not even the right system to serve people's needs, right? So we're trying to get people out of those systems, connected to behavioral health services, and trying to undo the harm caused by systems that perpetuate racism and oppression. Right, this is social justice work. Part of how we do that is using what's called the intercept model, which you'll see here. And this intercept model comes from the Gain Center, which is SAMHSA funded, and envisions a series of points of interception that can be made to prevent individuals from entering or penetrating deeper into the criminal justice system, the criminal legal system, excuse me. Right, so all of these kind of interactions that somebody might have, right? You'll see on the left that they might call a crisis line, right? In orange, they might come into contact with law enforcement, right, with the police. If they're arrested, they'll kind of in blue, you'll see they have their initial detention and their first court appearance. They might spend more time in jail in sort of that pink area, and then eventually kind of re-enter the community as we move further to the right. And maybe be on parole or probation eventually, right? And so I'll kind of walk through this, but I just kind of want to lay out the full picture before we kind of dive in. So let's start with intercept 0 and 1, right? This is community services and law enforcement. Right, this is before they might be incarcerated, before they might be brought into jail. And so some of the things in the tables on the right here, you'll see some of the things that we do here at King County. And so we have mobile crisis teams, for example, who go out and respond to people with behavioral health conditions, where we have trained social workers kind of accompanying law enforcement or first responders. One of my colleagues also does crisis intervention training, right? Helping police become more trauma-informed, learning more de-escalation techniques, things like that. And so one of these services kind of on that Intercept 0 is a crisis diversion facility, right? So instead of bringing people into hospital or jail, this actually directs people away from police, away from emergency rooms to enhance shelter options, where there are kind of like multiple staff, care managers, mental health professionals, access to food and medications, right, to help people live and stay in less restrictive settings. We also have law enforcement assisted diversion, or LEAD, which is a national program that was conceptualized as a community safety program, not just an approach to think about like individual law violations, but about the whole community and improving the well-being of the community as a whole. And it's a long-term response to law violations stemming from substance use, mental health, and poverty. Essentially, when an individual has a lot of interactions with the police or law enforcement, they the police or other community partners might make a referral to the LEAD program, which is kind of like intensive case management services delivered in the community, much like ACT, which are low barrier and implement a harm reduction approach, right? Also like ACT. So coming back to this Intercept, we'll then move on to the next one, which is sort of that initial detention or those initial court hearings. And so one of the services that we provide is what's called prosecutorial diversion, or LINC, the Legal Intervention Network of Care. And essentially what this does, this is a diversion program that connects people to services instead of being prosecuted, right? So if the prosecution, if the judge is on board, they'll say, you know what, you should just go meet up with a case manager. If you have like one contact with that team, we'll drop the charges. We won't prosecute. And so, you know, that's a team that instead of the legal system connects people to that, you know, that supportive team. And like ACT, the LINC team has similar features, right? It's community-based. They employ peer counselors. They have a multidisciplinary team. They work on person-centered services, and it's low barrier, right? The goal is to just bring people into contact with supportive services. So moving on to that third Intercept, what if somebody's in jail, right? What do we do if they're actually in jail? Well, we have a variety of programs. We have in-custody services with focus on serving veterans and folks with substance use histories. We have release planners who are actually like cited in the jail, who, when somebody has a discharge date or a release date, they'll start making plans with that person, right, to get them connected to services, to find a shelter where they can stay, to get their benefits reactivated. We also have specialty courts or therapeutic courts, right? So for folks who might have mental health conditions or substance use histories, or who might be veterans, there's actually separate courts. And the Seattle and King County mental health courts were some of the first in the nation to get started, and are really robust alternatives to typical kind of mainstream prosecution. And some of the services that these teams provide include sort of that public benefits navigation, medications upon release, right? Making sure that people have health insurance when they leave, and things like that. And then lastly, the last two Intercepts are sort of that reentry and community corrections, right? So we have reentry case management services. We have dedicated supportive housing for both the therapeutic courts and other intensive programs that we have. And then kind of with the last Intercept, the community corrections, we have several state reentry programs that are administered by Washington State. And some of those programs have really close connections between probation officers and the treatment teams or the service teams. Right. We also have a special needs unit in the Community Corrections Division here in Seattle that focuses more on folks with behavioral health conditions. And I want to focus next on what's underlined in Intercept 4, which is the Familiar Faces Initiative. And so the Familiar Faces Initiative really puts participants at the center of program development and led to the inception of the VITAL program and a number of other services that we have. including some of those release planners in jail. Familiar Faces was an initiative that brought together folks all across local government, as well as consumers and people with lived experience, to identify a set of solutions to folks who are being arrested really frequently. And by giving sort of the people with lived experience a seat at the table, we put those folks at the heart of identifying and solving the biggest problems that our community is facing. And so they have a role in decision-making, program development, community engagement, right, stakeholder relationships, and really valuable input. Like I said, one of the major outcomes of this was the development of the VITAL program, which is an intensive care management team, which serves a very specific population of folks who have 4 more bookings in a year out of 2 out of the last 3 years. But like ACT, it's a small team, right? There's a small census, excuse me. It only serves 60 people. And it delivers those services in the community with a multidisciplinary team, which might look a lot like the ACT graphic that we saw earlier, right? And the VITAL team, like ACT, coordinates across those systems. And we actually have brought together different providers, right? So all of these images that you see here are different providers. There's a housing agency that provides housing for folks. We work with the University of Washington Medical Center at Harborview. There's the REACH team that provides the care management and that outreach and those street services. And we even use some of our local funds to pay for a King County prosecutor to provide legal coordination for those teams. So that's a little bit more about what we do. And I want to move last to some of these, like just to summarize here, the touch points in the legal system that we've gone over include these various ones. And I think what's important here is, like, there are so many opportunities and options to connect folks to these behavioral health services. So moving finally to what can we as providers and oversight agencies and advocates do to kind of help coordinate across these systems and promote recovery for folks who are involved in the criminal legal system. The first one and most important one to me is to center people with lived experience on advisory and stakeholder groups, right? That was crucial to the Familiar Faces initiative and the development of the VITAL team, right? And similarly, that plays a role in ACT here in King County. We facilitate an ACT stakeholder advisory group where at least half of the members of the group are people with lived experience. It's part of the state program model, so I don't want to say that we've invented something new and groundbreaking here. It's part of the state program standards and the national model, but it's crucial and it's been really effective, right? We've been able to connect consumers and their families to different trainings like the Psychosis Reach program or training day, which kind of provides support to natural supports and caregivers of folks with psychosis. The stakeholder group has also provided recommendations on expanding ACT, right? We recently, a couple of years ago, tried to get a SAMHSA grant, and the stakeholders said, we want more medical services. So that was our proposal, to bring more folks from the medical realm onto the team. And the stakeholder group has also said, when we're trying to assess the team's performance, they're like, well, what do consumers think? So we're implementing kind of consumer satisfaction surveys to assess the team's performance. And so new program development is an opportunity to center the experience of people with lived experience, right? To center those voices. So like I mentioned before, the Familiar Faces Advisory Board relied on the input of consumers, right? Those voices were so important to some of those kind of initiatives that came out of Familiar Faces. And the program, I think, when we have program-centric silos, we end up with disparate and a patchwork of services, right? But when we have people who are receiving those services at the center of design, we have more integrated and more meaningful system reform that ultimately improves outcomes. So like I said with, the VITAL team, King County actually funds a legal expert, a prosecutor, to provide legal navigation and support to consumers on that behavioral health team. vital team, right? So we're using local funding for enhanced access and coordination with the legal system, with ultimately the goal of doing something other than prosecution or other than jail, right? And if we know that these, again, the sort of population that this team is serving, the vital team is serving, is folks with 4 or more bookings in a year. So if we know that the needs of the population include legal coordination, let's integrate that with the treatment team. So that's what we've done here, right? And ultimately that builds like the system capacity by strengthening these relationships between prosecutors and behavioral health providers, between houses and medical care, right? From the standpoint of my team, right, so my diversion and reentry services team here at the county, we provide a little bit of centralized coordination and training, again, for these sort of behavioral health and criminal legal systems. We do provider trainings, right? So we provide motivational interviewing training. We provide trainings on kind of the core competencies of what it means to serve folks with behavioral health conditions who are involved in the legal system. We also facilitate provider access to jails, right? King County Jail is a really big jail, thousands of kind of bookings every year. And it can be a hard place to kind of get into. And so if you want to bring behavioral health services to people who are involved in the criminal legal system, you sometimes have to go into jail. And so we work with the Department of Adult and Juvenile Detention, who operates the King County jails, to help get people access to that as behavioral health care providers. So if somebody gets booked, they can show up the next day and say, what do you need? How can we help? We also convene kind of managers meetings of the kind of managers and supervisors of different programs to kind of build those system connections, share positive outcomes, and kind of strengthen the system that way. We also help develop cross-system partnerships, right? So we bring people together, much like the Vital team brought together like houses and behavioral health and medical teams. We try to bridge gaps between some of those systems. And so one agency where we've done this, in full disclosure, Pioneer Human Services, is what I'm highlighting here. And that was where I got my start as, the ACT team lead. But I think it's a really good example because the agency, Pioneer, provides services, right? They've got that ACT team, they've got outpatient services, they have inpatient residential treatment for folks with co-occurring mental health and substance use conditions. They also provide housing, both transitional and permanent, and they coordinate with the courts. They actually provide housing, temporary housing to folks who are involved in both drug and mental health courts, because we know that people are much more likely to sort of exit the legal system, exit the criminal legal system, if they have that foundation of kind of housing and support. And the agency also provides kind of vocational training as well. And when all of these are integrated under the same agency, and when we at DRS have kind of brought these funding streams together and brought these partners to the table, the outcome is better for the person. And so as I wrap up here, just, kind of get your checklists ready. These are just some practical tips for direct service providers who might be working with folks in the criminal legal system. First is get to know a defense attorney, get to know a prosecutor, right? Or if you're in the legal system, get to know a behavioral health care provider, right? Just having those relationships and being able to call somebody and say, I don't know when this person's next court date is. Can you help me figure that out, right? Or like, I don't know what this whole like competency to stand trial is. Can you help explain that to me? That can be really helpful, right? Those relationships are crucial. Also make a concrete reentry plan, right? Release is a really vulnerable time, and incarceration is disruptive and traumatic in somebody's life. So these supports, making sure that somebody's basic needs are taken care of, to make sure they've got the medications they need, to make sure they know where they can go for a safe place, whether that's housing or a shelter. All of these supports are super necessary at a really difficult and traumatic time. Similarly, go to court, right? Most courts are kind of open to the public. So you can go to either support, just be an advocate, or just sit and kind of learn from that experience, right? So I think, periods of incarceration are also a time to revise a service plan, right? Focus on vocational goals. Maybe somebody needs more access to benefits. If you're working with peer counselors, like leverage that support. People appreciate knowing that somebody else has gone through this and came out of it, in a stronger place. For funders, government agencies, other oversight bodies, elevate voices of people with lived experience in stakeholder groups, in advisory groups, right? In committees, give them a seat at the table so that their voice informs what we do. Not to draw too much of the distinction between us and them there, right? But I think typically we look towards the sort of the experts, right? The head of a particular government agency, the head of behavioral health, right? But really center people with lived experience in those conversations. For folks who have access, for agencies, governments who have access to flexible funding sources, right? We can blend Medicaid and non-Medicaid funding to kind of leverage different services. We can use some of those funds if they're flexible enough to pay for access to housing or legal partners. Again, I talked about kind of the work that my team at DRS does. We do this cross-systems training and helping to build those partnerships, right? We help providers get access to jails and coordinate with jail health staff. I've mentioned peers throughout this, but I really think that if we had peers on every behavioral health treatment team or behavioral health service team, we would be in a lot better place, right? So I'm a strong advocate, and in a lot of the kind of programs that I've highlighted today, there is a role for a peer support specialist, right? ACT, VITAL, LEAD. The last thing I would really add is sort of where are opportunities, right? If you're working in a government or in some of these systems, where are opportunities on this continuum to connect people to services, right? Is it in the first place in some of those sort of crisis lines? How can we divert people away from those services earlier on, right? How can we make sure that our law enforcement and police better respond to behavioral health crises? How can we get more alternatives to prosecution to get people out of that system if they have been arrested? What in-custody services can we offer? How can we get more people, more providers to do outreach in the jail? What kind of follow-up is best for folks re-entering the community? Do we have programs that can visit people in the jail and then follow them afterwards? Or how can we better work with, community corrections, probation, parole? Right. Again, the goal is to help people work through this system and help people avoid criminal legal involvement. And I would just sort of close by saying that connecting people to the right services in the right systems creates new pathways to justice and recovery, right? We're aiming to meet people's express felt needs, and doing so is how we support people to become more independent, more free, and more successful and satisfied in their own lives. So I hope that I've kind of like summarized this enough. You're probably tired of this slide a little bit, but I hope that we've been able to kind of like see those three person-centered elements, at least three person-centered elements, right? Those relationship, peer counselors, multidisciplinary teams, strengths-based. I hope that by outlining the kind of intercept model, that we've been able to identify those touch points in the system where we can connect people to different behavioral health services. And I hope that in talking about some of the work that we do, we've also kind of thought about how you can improve the whole system, right? And how we can coordinate better between behavioral health and the criminal legal system. So with that, I will wrap up and hopefully allow some time for questions. I know that I raced through that because I think there were some technical difficulties at the beginning. Yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions, and we'll also just put a website or what you can kind of Google search to get more information about what we do.